Welcome to Journeys Through Sociology. I'm Lale Bebahanyan, and I'll be your host for this series of interviews sponsored by the ISA, the International Sociological Association. Journeys Through Sociology is a series of interviews with the 22 members of the Executive Committee of the ISA that aims to give viewers a sense of how these various scholars approach their work as sociologists. We'll be discussing some of the sociological endeavors they're currently engaged in, some of the factors that initially drew them to sociology, and some of the challenges that they faced along the way. So each week, we'll be posting another interview with a different executive committee member where they'll share their thoughts with us on their own journey through sociology. Now, the ISA Executive Committee is strewn throughout the world, residing in different nations throughout the world, reflecting the diversity of the ISA itself, which draws its membership from 167 different countries. Our hope is that these interviews reflect that diversity and together give us a sense of the kinds of possibilities, but also challenges facing sociologists throughout the world. And today, we launch this series of interviews with Dr. Michael Burawoy, who is currently the president of the ISA. Dr. Burawoy is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, where he's now been teaching for 35 years. And although he was originally trained as a mathematician, he went on to receive an MA in sociology at the University of Zambia, and later a PhD in sociology at the University of Chicago. And he is perhaps best known for his ethnographic work on labor and the politics of production in industrial workplaces. His earliest project involved doing participant observation in the copper mines in Zambia, where he studied the organization of labor in the post-colonial era. He then moved on to Chicago, where he worked as a machine operator in a factory and studied the ways in which consent was produced among workers on the factory floor, becoming the basis of his book, Manufacturing Consent. He then became interested in the organization of production under socialism, and he went to Hungary, where he worked as a furnaceman in the steel mills in the 1980s. But while Dr. Burawoy was working away in the steel mills, state socialism in Hungary crumbled, and that led him to Russia, where he again engaged in ethnographic fieldwork in a factory, this time to be interrupted by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And throughout all of this work, Dr. Burawoy has particularly emphasized the importance of ethnography as a way of illuminating the standpoint of the working class, a kind of bottom-up view to the politics of production. And aside from this extensive work on labor, he's also spent many years nurturing the development of what he calls public sociology, sociology that is engaged with and informed by publics. And in his role as president of the American Sociological Association, he did quite a bit of work developing public sociology. And now, as the current president of the ISA, he's also launched a number of exciting projects that hopefully he'll discuss with us today. So Dr. Burawoy, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Yes.
So actually, I would like to begin today by asking you to just share a little bit about some of the projects that you've been working on as president of the ISA.
Yes, no, I would be delighted to do just that. Yes, no, I think when I became president, one of my agendas was to try and include the excluded. You know, so many sociologists around the world can't afford to go to Gothenburg, to Yokohama, to our congresses, to our forums. And so I thought it would be good for us to sort of try and exploit digital media to get at populations of sociologists that are perhaps more rooted in specific locales. Perhaps also sociologists who are sort of not linked into a community of sociologists. So with that in mind, we in the ISA developed a number of different projects. The first was actually to develop a newsletter. Amazingly, the ISA really didn't have a newsletter. Its research committees did and do, but the ISA itself did not. So we launched this global dialogue, as we call it. And I had in mind something relatively sort of modest, 3 or 4 pages every few months. But it has turned out to be a major project. And it's actually more than a newsletter. It's like a review. It comes out 5 times a year. And originally I thought perhaps if we're very lucky, we could get it in 3 languages. People said that would be very difficult. But actually, at this point in time, we have it in 11 languages. And it's just been an amazing collaborative effort across the world, joining teams of young sociologists together in this translation. So that's global dialogue. The second project was something I began a year and a half ago, and that was called Universities in Crisis. You know, in most places in the world today, universities are indeed in crisis. I think the exceptions may be China, perhaps Brazil, perhaps Taiwan, but most places, Europe, North America, most of Latin America, Asia, universities are indeed in crisis, subject to a pincer movement of regulation on the one side and commercialization on the other. So we have set up this blog to actually sort of give an assessment of these different situations of crisis. I think it's important that we as sociologists sort of examine the sort of workplace where we ourselves work and to understand the limits and possibilities of that workplace and the directions of change. I guess the third, perhaps, and you know yourself, we did this together, the third project, again, there's something I really hadn't a clue about before I began it, called Global Sociology Live. This was an endeavor to bring sociologists from around the world into a conversation with students at Berkeley. The sociologists would be Skyped in or video conferenced in, and there would be a discussion. And then the whole thing would be itself broadcast on YouTube with the help of the Berkeley ETS team. And it turned out, again, to be a really fantastic success that we did last semester. We'd done this course that we taught on global sociology, which sort of had a rhythm of its own and indeed did bring in many people from different places in the world. And next semester, we're hoping to try and do this again in an even more ambitious form called Public Sociology Live. So I guess that's the third, and I suppose the other fourth moment of digital world is precisely what we're doing here today. I was so impressed with the executive committee of the ISA, the people elected by the members of the ISA to run the ISA, that I thought it would be really nice if the members really knew who is in fact leading the association and the very distinctive and interesting backgrounds from which they come. And so that's the point of these journeys through sociology, as you call them, to bring to display the diversity and richness of the sociologists that are running the ISA today, perhaps reflective of the breadth and depth of sociology in different parts of the world. Yeah. So I guess that is what I'm really excited about in my role as president of the ISA. Yeah.
So if perhaps actually we could switch gears a little bit now, and I'd like to ask you a question that we're going to in fact pose to all of the interviewees, which is, could you share with us 3 factors that kind of initially drew you to sociology?
Just 3, you say, huh?
That's our limit, yes.
That's our limit. We have to be very careful in what you say and what you choose. It's so difficult to know exactly what leads one to be a sociologist. One can go back into one's family history, but I actually want to start rather late in my life. Well, not that late. So I think the first factor I would like to stress was my own sort of migration. I was brought up in Manchester, England, in a relatively sheltered middle-class home of sort of immigrant parents, actually. And between school and university, I decided, for reasons that are not exactly clear to me, to make a trip to the United States of America. I had 6 months to spare, and somehow I thought, well, that would be an interesting thing to do. Nobody else was dreaming of that. In fact, when my friends heard about this, it was a sort of betrayal. Going to the United States was seen in that time to be a betrayal. This crass commercial place. But very few people actually had visited. This was a '65. It was difficult to go to the United States. In fact, I went there on a Norwegian cargo boat that took about 15 days. That was the cheapest way I could go. But anyway, it was that experience of 6 months and 5 months, 6 months in the United States, 3 months in New York. I mean, it was traumatic experience, overpowering experience of, going to this amazing city, the lights of which I had never seen before. Yeah, it was a very intimidating. I don't think I opened my mouth for 3 months. I mean, it was such an intimidating experience. And then I was a camp counselor, sort of thing that students do in the United States. And I got fired from the camp. We won't talk about that. And then I traveled around the US. It was a time of civil rights movement was emerging, anti-war movement. This was a very exciting and optimistic period in US history, which really influenced my own vision and made it very difficult for me to return to England, particularly to Cambridge, which is a sort of parasitic and sort of very detached place, a sort of paradise on earth, you might say. But it really was so detached. And when I returned there, as I found it when I returned in 1965, to be this mathematician. Yeah. So that, I think, is my first.
Well, what would you say? What was it about those experiences in the U.S. that drew you to sociology in particular, to thinking sociologically?
Well, I guess it was just the existence of the idea that societies can be different was so powerfully present. Yeah, the language was the same, but Britain and the United States couldn't be more different. And of course, the idea of social movements. I mean, and I became very interested in the student movement. That social movements can actually change the world, as I thought at that time. I think those were two factors that perhaps subliminally were affecting my sort of embryonic sociological consciousness. Yeah.
And so you still have two more out of your three.
Two more. Okay. Two more. All right. Well, I went Cambridge. I want to stick with Cambridge. Yeah, Cambridge. I hated Cambridge. It was the most miserable years of my life. Part because I was doing mathematics and I couldn't find anything else to do. Economics seemed even more boring, and sociology didn't exist. So what I did was try and escape for as long as I possibly could. And in Cambridge, you had these 4 months vacation, summer vacation. And I used to go every vacation to do a different part of the world. At the end of the first, I went to Africa. And I don't want to say anything about that just at this point. What I want to stress is the end of my second year, in 1967, summer of 67, I went to India. Again, very interested in the role of education and its potentiality, its potential transformative role. I was interested in a question that I picked up from some Fabian pamphlet about the medium of instruction in university education. So I thought I would go to India and investigate this matter. I mean, I was only 18 or 19 and, absurdly naive about everything and young. But anyway, off I went. Now, this was another amazing experience for me. I'd never been in a society where it was so densely populated, where rich and poor were shoulder to shoulder, where different layers of civilization were ever present actually on the streets. This was an amazing sight. I think it sort of affects anybody who goes there who's never been there. But it was not so much the society itself I want to stress in terms of it shaping my sociology. It was the project. Which language was my question? Which language should students in the universities learn through? Which language? Should it be the national language, Hindi, one of the regional languages, of which there were, I think, 18 at the time, or should it be English, which was the language of the elite? And I thought this was a technical question. So I went round the country, essentially examining students, seeing in which language they performed better. Is it English or Hindi or the regional language? And so I would come up with an answer, and that would be the solution. Did I learn a lot in those 3 months in India. What I learned was that the medium of instruction in university education was not a educational issue at all. But it was in part a technical issue, but it was largely a political issue, as anybody who has ever lived in India knows only too well. That this was a political and social issue around which people struggled, that language was a terrain of political struggle, controlling people's access to resources to different classes. That's, in my view, where I learned to be a sociologist. The direct experience of realizing that this was not a technical educational problem, but it had to be understood in its social, political, and economic context. I think this was, for me, a real revelation from which I never recovered. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, well, that's my second. Now you want my third, I guess.
I'd love your third, yes.
Okay, yes. All right, my third. Well, look, yeah. I guess my third was really when I became officially a sociologist. I pursued a sociological degree, and that was in Zambia. As I said, I really couldn't stand, it was 1968 when I graduated from Cambridge with this maths degree. The last thing I wanted to do was to stay in England, boring England. And so I went back to Africa. I'd been there in 1966 in my summer vacation. I went back to South Africa. I became a journalist. Had no right to be a journalist since I barely wrote and spoke. Well, I spoke English, but I was not trained. My English was pretty poor. But anyway, because I had a white skin, and this was South Africa, I was able to get a job as a journalist on a magazine called News Check. It was like sort of it was like Business Week of South Africa. And I was a correspondent for foreign affairs. Anyway, I did this for several months. And really, South Africa was in a very repressive period, very gloomy period politically. And so I abandoned South Africa, went to Zambia. And it was in Zambia this was 1968, the end of 68. This was 4 years after independence. I went there with a view, actually, to once more seeking out students who might be potential play a potentially sort of transformative role in Zambian society. Yes. Well, anyway, I had to survive. So the people I knew, they suggested I get a job on the Copper Belt. I managed to get a job on the Copper because I knew some executive in Anglo American, one of the biggest mining corporations in Africa. And it was there that I sort of began my first real genuine field work in sociology, studying. Well, they didn't know what I was studying. I kept this a secret, but I was actually studying the changes in the racial order in the copper mines. So 50,000 employees. It had been a color bar society, white over black. What happened to the color bar in post-colonial Zambia? Well, what I was observing everywhere, I went, and as I did my field work and as I collected data, because I was very well placed to collect data in this personnel research unit where I was employed, I discovered, but I discovered that the color bar was being maintained. It was like a floating color bar. The color bar floated up, but it was still a color bar. It was still white over black. And that was my sort of first piece of research, and I think probably my best piece of research, studying the actual reproduction, the maintenance, persistence of the racial or the colonial racial order into the post-colonial period, and asking why. Why, given that the United National Independence Party UNIP's whole project was to dismantle the racial order, why was it sustained in the copper industry of all places? Well, and so that is really, I suppose, the third sort of major influence. It's there as I became a sociologist, and I went to the University of Zambia to actually study sociology for the first time in my life, and got my MA in sociology and social anthropology there in university. Yes, I suppose that's my third factor, the experience in Zambia. That was transformative. Yes.
Those three stories of the U.S., India, and Zambia, actually, they give us a very kind of fascinating glimpse into what drew you to sociology, what kind of got your sociological imagination flowing. But I'd also like to pose another question that we'll be posing to all the interviewees as well. So in this in your trajectory as a sociologist, can you share with us what you feel are maybe three of the challenges you faced in doing sociology?
Tell me, Lali, how much time do we have left? Do you know?
We have about 10 minutes. So
10 minutes, okay.
Which is why I'm limiting you to threes, because can you
Yes.
imagine if we had 5 or 6?
All right. Well, look, the first is just surviving graduate school. As I said, I took my degree, my MA in Zambia. It was traumatic experience. I didn't go through many traumatic experiences. That was really a very difficult experience. It was the first challenge. You know, I was surrounded by 3 very articulate faculty. And there were 3 students in the beginning doing MA in the end. There was just me. And every week I would have to write a paper. And the project of these 3 faculty was to tear the paper apart. And, you know, this was, I was being terrorized, I felt. And of course, one wondered whether one would ever make it as a sociologist. And then they didn't always help. One of them said, when I wrote what appeared to him to be a reasonable paper, he said, well, did you write that yourself? Yeah. And I remember asking that same gentleman, who will remain nameless, I said, would you write me a letter of recommendation? And he said, well, it wouldn't be much of one. Well, anyway, so it was a very difficult situation for me. I wondered every day whether I was cut out to be a sociologist. And I suppose that continued in Chicago. When I went to Chicago, I guess I sort of smuggled myself into the graduate department of sociology there, encouraged to apply there, wanting to return to the United States. And that, too, was a very difficult experience. I thought that I would be ready for anything after Zambia, after being gone through the mill in Zambia. But there, too, you know, I remember in the first quarter, I mean, I just felt, you know, I should just quit. I mean, I'm just not up to this. And I'm just not on the same wavelength as the faculty. I was very lucky, actually, that William Julius Wilson, who since became a very famous sociologist, protected me and was my shelter in the sociology department. And I found an inspiring teacher in the political science department who led me down the Marxist path, a fellow called by the name of Adam Przeworski. But, you know, this was also a very difficult. So I think the first challenge was just surviving graduate school, having faith that you really can be a sociologist.
Which I think would actually, hearing your experience of this is probably reassuring for graduate students all over the world who share that sentiment and wonder whether they're cut out for sociology. So to hear that from Dr. Michael Burawoy is reassuring, to say the least.
Yes.
So your second challenge, Dr. Burawoy.
My second challenge. The second challenge is teaching. I really went into sociology, which I haven't said before, because I thought that this was something that I could teach in a very sort of exciting manner, because it sort of embraced so many different walks of life, so many different approaches, and could bring the lived experience of students into the classroom and into the actual dialogue around sociology. Yeah, and I remember when I came to Berkeley, I was very lucky to get the job here, very lucky. I remember all my colleagues said, oh, these undergraduates, they know nothing, they don't talk, they just look at you blankly, they don't work, Well, anyway, I soon found differently, but it was, in the beginning, obviously very difficult to continue to engage, 100, 200 students in the topic of sociology. I was teaching theory, getting them to read Durkheim, Division of Labor. Well, you know what that's like, Ali. Yeah. So, I mean, it was a challenge. But I found Berkeley sociologists, undergraduates, to be really ready, actually, to learn, to participate, to engage. I've always been admired the way that they can collectively participate, no matter how many students, in a sort of public discussion. So it was a challenge, but it was also very satisfying. I guess teaching graduate students, PhD students, that's been a challenge all along, and it still is a challenge, You never know whether you make any difference or you make mistakes. I mean, with graduate students, it's a very uncertain, rocky road. Rocky Road, yeah.
So then
All right, yes.
one of your
yes.
challenges is the challenge of being a student. The other challenge is that of being a teacher. And what would you say is the third challenge you faced
Yeah,
as a
well, I
sociologist?
think the third is to go back to being a student. You see, what I've been doing is doing this ethnography on different shop floors around the world. I mean, I was in Zambia as a worker. Well, I actually was a sort of white collar worker. I was a researcher there. But then, as you said in the beginning, in Chicago, I was this semi-skilled operator, and Hungary the same, and Russia the same. And the funny thing is, I'm incompetent. I'm an incompetent worker. I don't have any sort of blue collar skills. And so it was a continual learning process for me. But it was humiliating. It was humiliating because I was clearly so incompetent to everybody around me. And often I didn't know the language sufficiently well to even realize how incompetent I was. It is interesting how in different countries people respond to incompetence. At least in Hungary, they sort of embraced me. And I had a very sort of rich experience on the shop floor and beyond. In Chicago, they wanted to have nothing to do with me, and for good reason. I nearly killed them by my incompetence. I nearly killed myself on these very dangerous machines. And the same in Russia. Russia, well, they couldn't figure out, who the hell is this guy, coming from American professor, he's coming here to work on the shop floor. That's unheard of. Must be a spy. This was 1991, before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it was really hard work to actually penetrate the mist and the blank looks that my fellow workers gave me. In the end, one does if one goes to work every day. But it was a difficult and arduous project. All of them were. Not sure what the real benefits were, except I think that I learned, which was, of course, the intent, what it meant to be a worker on the shop floor. And as a Marxist, I think that was very important, that I understand what it really means to be a worker in these industrial plants. And of course, I learned it very interestingly how in different cultures, people respond to incompetence in different ways. Yes. Anyway, so I think humiliation on the shop floor. I think every sociologist should experience, particularly teachers should experience a bit of humiliation. There should be this movement between the teacher and the student role. The educators should become the educated. And then that's what really happened to me when I moved out of the university into the factory. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. And I look forward to hearing other ISA executive committee members talk about their challenges, because I anticipate that we'll get a kind of very diverse view of the challenges facing sociologists in different parts of the world. Yeah. And unfortunately, our time is running short, but there is one last question that I would love to ask you, Dr. Burawoy, which is, if you hadn't become a sociologist, what might you have liked to be?
Well, actually, of all the questions you've asked me, this seems to be the clearest. I wanted to be an astrophysicist. I was obsessed with astronomy in my teenage years, as I am now obsessed with sociology. And I built my own telescope. I used to give talks on astronomy, and my dream was to be an astrophysicist. I was captured, enraptured by the theories of the universe, the theories of the evolution of stars, of galaxies, of the planetary system. Well, and that's why I was doing mathematics. But when I got to Cambridge, well, after I went to the United States, everything changed. I just saw a different world. I mean, and the world of astrophysics, particularly as it would have to really appear after I got my mathematics degree, sort of lost its glory. And I became interested in sociology. So that's where I would have loved to have been. But I want to answer your question in a just slightly different way also. There was a time in my life when I thought I'd have to give up sociology as a career. And that was when I was up for tenure at University of California, Berkeley. And it looked as though I wasn't going to get tenure. And so I had to think about, well, what would I do? Obviously, one would look for other jobs in sociology, but I thought very seriously that perhaps I should actually give up sociology and do something else. What would I do? And I thought that I would become a mathematics teacher. I love to teach, and I love to teach mathematics. I may not be a great sort of original contributor to mathematics, but teaching it, I sort of liked. It had a certain sort of aesthetic appeal. So I thought that's what I would be. I think throughout my life, I wanted to be a teacher, and I think that's the greatest privilege, actually, no one can enjoy, to be a teacher. I feel very fortunate that I have been able to do that at this university in California, but I think I would have loved to do it anywhere. And so I think it's an enormous privilege. I think as a privilege, but it's also can be quite dangerous. I think, when one is, it's always a challenge, but when one is successful and when one has one's students with one, then one has enormous power. I think one has to also sort of be very aware of both the challenge and the power of teaching and the danger of teaching, and to be very self-conscious about one's teaching. But I just want to end on this note that really, teaching is really what it's all about.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and for helping us launch this series of interviews. We very much appreciate it, Dr. Burawoy.
Well, thank you very much for being there to ask me these questions and for inaugurating this wonderful series. Thank you very much, Sally.
Thank you. So this has been our first journey through sociology with Dr. Michael Burawoy, and we thank you for joining us.